From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
There is enough evidence already on the table to show that Joe Biden lied when he told the American people he knew nothing about his son Hunter's overseas business dealings. He was obviously intimately involved in them because he was meeting the business partners and talking to them on the phone and etc.
This is your host, Scot Bertram, and that's Miranda Devine, columnist at the New York Post, Fox News contributor, and author of the bestseller Laptop from Hell. We'll talk with Miranda later on in today's program to get an update on that laptop from hell. First, we're joined by Matt Mehan. He is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government at the Hillsdale College Graduate School of Government in D.C. Dr. Mehan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Discussing a piece written recently over at Real Clear Education. It's a long title. More schools playing the parental role, but not for the good of students. And this is something that I think people have noticed, especially in the past couple of years, especially post-COVID. What do you think was that trigger for schools, though, to begin to think that they know what's absolutely best for children, the foolish parents who lack our expertise sort of point of view?
I think it's a kind of perfect storm, and COVID wound up being a kind of cherry on top, or the final catalyst of intensification and then reactive horror from parents. But I mean, you could take this all the way back to the progressives in education. Dewey, he describes, just reading it recently again, he describes the school as an organ of the state, right? Which is basically flipping the whole idea of the school as something that helps serve parents in the education of their children. Mm-hmm. Now the school is a representative agent of the state who's basically sort of taking the child from the family. That's a very adversarial sort of view of the expert educator descending like vultures upon the carcass of a family to take a pound of flesh, that is the child, away from it. That whole situation, I think, has only increased. But not to just place all on those problems. It's also the family with the divorce, single parenthood, mm-hmm. two incomes, right? There's a lot more sort of exhaustion on the part of a family to where lots of families don't have a lot of sort of human resources to educate their children. And so you do have some, children who really need to lean on schools in a way that they didn't normally. And so I think the combination of those two things have sort of come to a head. But families that do have some resources to actually guide their children's education now find themselves in this sort of pit fight with the schools, which is, a disaster we're seeing unfold on Twitter and elsewhere.
In this essay, you make an observation that a parent's love for their children is an expertise of its own. It's one that schools can't replicate no matter what. What makes that loving expertise in ways superior than whatever is claimed by administrators or teachers?
The phrase "to know is to love," that actually works both ways, right? That when you know something well, when you really attend to it, you start to come to love its various characteristics, even its flaws. You sort of see as sort of a beautiful part of the whole of the thing. So the old joke, you got to love your spouse's flaws even, right? Mm-hmm. Like the ones you can't change, just love them, and you can't change most of them. But it goes the other way too. To love is to know, right? That when you have strong affections, right, you tend to zealously come to know more about mm-hmm. them. And this is where nature comes in. Parents have a natural affection for their children, right? Even if they're adopted children, just the proximity and the care and the reliance, that bond of parent and child is incredibly intense and causes deep love, which is part and parcel to and wrapped up with deep knowledge, right? And so to know is to love, and to love is to know. That means that you have an expert in the room when you're discussing what a child needs, what they need to develop, what's their next step, what's bad for them and good for them in their studies. They need some leisure to do that, mm-hmm. and they can't do it all, and that's why we have schools and teachers, because it's just not possible to, in a developed civilization, to give them all the education they need just from parents alone. Even homeschoolers have to rely on textbooks and teachers
Sure.
and online classes and tutors and co-ops and things like that. So, but I do think it's basically the nature of the family that leads to this expertise.
And we do, though, trust teachers, administrators, coaches, others with our children at times. It's necessary. And that brings up this phrase, in loco parentis. What does this mean generally understood, and what should it mean properly understood?
Yeah, so it's a Latin term, comes out of, I think, very deep common law roots. By common law roots, I mean jus gentium roots, like the laws of the peoples. And by that, I mean deep in the nature of things, right? So this is natural law unto common law unto, it gets used in case law and in common discussion. In loco parentis, in the place of the parent. Now, it commonly means today, tragically, I would say, sort of stepping in and taking control when parents fail. And there is certainly that valence of that understanding of that phrase. But it had a less adversarial understanding the older and further back you go, to where it's a kind of, obviously, when we are teaching, educating, coaching, instructing, stewarding, field trip proctoring, anything that involves a child, if you're not the parent, you are basically standing in place of the parent as their ministerial assistant, right? As their servant. You're serving the family and serving the child at the behest and direction of the parents. And even the logic of the phrase is basically an implied understanding of the primacy of the parents as the primary and first and most expert educators, the natural and rightful educators. That is to say, in loco parentis, we stand in the place of the parent, meaning why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just stand in the place of school or the place of government or the place of coach? The notion is the parent is the rightful role, and you take that place as a substitute teacher, right? Whenever you do educate a child. So having recourse and sort of going back to the natural principle of what this common law phrase in loco parentis means, I think is a very important thing to do right now to sort of refresh our understanding of the duties, responsibilities, and rights of parents vis-a-vis schools, government, and everything else.
Talking with Dr. Matt Mehan, his piece at Real Clear Education, more schools playing the parental role, but not for the good of students. Should we be concerned about schools, teachers who are in ways encouraging children to challenge the authority, challenge the wisdom of their parents?
The short answer is no. That's not proper. The long answer is, by presenting truths, sometimes you can disrupt, right, traditions or customs that might not be healthy or correct. But by presenting them in a fair and dialogic way with the family, right, that's the proper way in which you might challenge parental authority, right? That is, you don't sneak it past the eye of the parent. You engage the parent. And this is part of the reason why healthy schools engage parents first. They talk to the parents about their curriculum. They talk to the parents about challenges with their students at school, right? That there is an open channel of communication. And, that teachers do have certain expertise. They might see something that a parent can't see. But the point is, that's when they, as the secondary educator, should then alert the primary educator and initiate a conversation with the family, rather than secretly or quietly manipulate the child away from the family. Because if you know, and we do, that love is an expertise, right? Then you're basically driving a wedge between the parent and child, when the parent is best for that child to help direct them towards their adult, fullness of virtue, health, and joy.
This phrase that you used, trying to sneak it past parents, I feel that's part of the consternation that parents felt around COVID, when they were able to see inside classrooms via Zoom, or see more of the textbooks, see more of the lessons that were being taught. And this idea that there are now secrets kept at school away from parents. We're going to talk about this, but don't tell your parents. In other situations, we'd be really freaked out about that. Someone tells your kid, don't tell your parents. Be really freaked out about that. But it seems more and more common that that's happening in some school environments.
Yeah, it's completely inappropriate. It's a moral evil. It's an injustice. It's a legal problem. And there are certain states that are making it easier for schools to do that. And thank goodness there are certain states that are making it harder. But it's a terrible thing to do on all the grounds we just mentioned. But it is happening. For instance, people are keeping secrets about, wanting to identify as the opposite sex, et cetera, or whatever, And then they don't tell the parents that, even though statistically we all know that when people identify that way, that they're very often in a much higher bracket of percentile for suicide and self-harm. But to not alert the parents to that is just such a grave evil. It's just a terrible thing that has to be opposed. We have to speak up. That's why I wrote the piece, was to basically give some armament to people to think this through and oppose it.
So how would you describe a proper role for schools in the upbringing of children?
I sort of used the phrase a moment ago, but parents are the primary educators, teachers are the secondary educators. And so a proper understanding of a school's relationship to the parent is that they assist the parents in the moral, spiritual, intellectual, and physical formation of their children. That's education, is helping them become the whole person, right? So if it's understood as something other than assisting parents, you have a problem. Now, how does that work? Right. Part of that, I think, is the logic behind school choice, is that, yes, parents may disagree with certain schools. There might be friction there and irresolvable problems of, like, the school can't just adjust and cater to every desire of every parent.
Right.
But that's why Americans have homeschooling, co-ops, private schools, public schools, school choice, right? Like that if a parent doesn't think that they can have that relationship, or if a school doesn't think that they can really play second fiddle to that parent because of the oddities or differences in beliefs or educational desires, well, then there's another way to go. And that's a huge argument for school choice and charters and a lot of these other things. But I think that's the general model, and it can be very adaptive and flexible. My daughter goes to a private school. It's a wonderful school. I trust it incredibly. They were doing one thing in a class that I was like, I think I know better, because I'm a huge lit nerd. So I actually think I've got a very specialized opinion. So I just went to them and asked, like, I would like to handle this bit of teaching with her. Mm-hmm. So they pulled her out of the class for a week, right? It wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't like the authority of the whole school was challenged. It was, I'm the primary educator. I see something that I want to refine my child's education. I can't do that all the time, but I can today, right? That kind of flexibility, trust, adaptability, that's the kind of way that schools should operate, as opposed to bureaucratic, self-protective, and self-willing, like, we are the experts and you can't. Like, all of that is pride, stupidity, and I think mission drift from what a good school is.
Talking with Dr. Matt Mehan from Hillsdale in D.C., where he serves as Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government. You use the phrase secondary educators, and I wonder if we should talk about the need for parents to be aware of different types of secondary educators, be it coaches, as we talked about earlier, or maybe it's YouTube, or maybe it's TikTok. These other entities that are coming in voluntarily or involuntarily and having a profound effect on our children.
Right. This phrase in loco parentis can be used in a variety of helpful ways, and this is one. The parent can take the phrase and go, anybody teaching or talking to my kids about basically anything is standing in the place of the parent, even, by the way, peers of a student, right? And if you let peers have too much power over a child, like if they're constantly being able to text or be in a group text in middle school on their phones, and their peers are haunting their lives at all times at 10 at night in the bed, like that's in loco parentis. But so too an Instagram, a YouTube influencer, a Netflix series, right? They're teaching something. They're giving a vision of the world. And if you're not aware of that, you're basically letting someone stand in your place and form your child. And so you have to be very wary of this digital presence, that where you can have all kinds of different people and things stand in loco parentis. But it's a reminder to parents, like, oh, it's a 24-hour job, and anybody who's forming my child in any way is taking my role. So I better make sure that that's well done and to the good.
I know there are arguments out there about parents, I would say perhaps on either extreme. Either parents are disengaged from their children and from their children's education for whatever reason, or perhaps I'll use the phrase, they love them too much. They're I don't know, a smothering effect, perhaps. And that in those cases, perhaps schools can and might be in the role to assert themselves on behalf of the well-being of the child. Are there circumstances in which that makes sense?
I mean, yes, certainly. And I kind of alluded to this at the beginning regarding the family is in trouble too. And so schools have to come in and help sometimes. And there is a role for in loco parentis. Like if a child is being beaten, right, then the state comes in and says, okay, we're going to do in loco parentis because you're not doing it. Right. So there is this proper role but I do think that for schools, it really needs to be on the level of law, right? If there's a problem at that level, then by all means. But we have a First Amendment, religious liberty. If you have some different view of the cosmos of the world and you're like, oh no, I have to insert myself. Like, no, you don't get to do that to a child. You have no business doing that. We're a free society. And we settle those problems through friendship, community, conversation, deliberation, legislation. We don't do it by surreptitiously sneaking a value into a child against the wishes of their parent. Like that's not stepping in. So there's a place, but I think criminal law, right? Like serious, like actual dangers of health that are covered by the law is the place that gives you clear, understood, and agreed upon grounds to do that kind of work.
Last question here for Dr. Matt Mehan from Hillsdale College. His piece at Real Clear Education, More Schools Playing the Parental Role, but Not for the Good of Students. We have seen parents and parents' organizations become far more active post-COVID in trying to reassert authority over what children are taught or the proper role of parents in education. What do you think of those efforts so far, generally? Can more be done?
Yes. In the piece, I actually give a particular shout out to Moms for Liberty, which I know some of them, I've helped work with them on a couple of things. They're wonderful, they're feisty, and they're successful. They've actually been flipping school boards. I think they just got another 50 more school board members around the country on. They had 180 or something before. Don't quote me on the numbers, but they're moving the ball down the field to actually get school boards at the public school level, basically in a position to solve some of these problems and stop some of these corruptive, violations of in loco parentis and parents as primary educators. So I do think it's a great thing, and we need a lot more of it, though. It really needs to spread like wildfire because, like you said, parents sometimes are a little sleepy on this, and it comes from a long tradition of trust.
Yeah.
And now that trust is broken, and we have to reestablish it.
Dr. Matt Mehan, he is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government at the Hillsdale College Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C. You can read his piece at Real Clear Education, More Schools Playing the Parental Role, but Not for the Good of Students. Dr. Mehan, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks, Scott.
Up next, we talk with journalist Miranda Devine about her best-selling book, Laptop from Hell, Hunter Biden, Big Tech, and the Dirty Secrets the President Tried to Hide. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Do you believe in our founders' vision for America? That our republic will only survive if we are an educated and informed people who know our rights and duties. Since 1844, Hillsdale College has sought to educate all who wish to learn about these timeless principles of self-government. For more than 50 years, the college has worked to spread that mission by sending Imprimis to millions of Americans. Imprimis features some of the best speeches given at Hillsdale events, and now an audio version of the popular Speech Digest is available in a new podcast of the same name. And, like the print publication, Imprimis, the podcast, is always free. Listen to the best arguments from speakers such as Chris Rufo, Molly Hemingway, Mark Stein, and Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, read by Hillsdale students. Subscribe today to listen to Imprimis at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Miranda Devine. She's a columnist with the New York Post, also the author of the best-selling book Laptop from Hell. You can find her on X, formerly Twitter, at Miranda Devine. Miranda, thanks so much for joining us.
Terrific. Thanks very much for having me.
Walking through a bit of this Hunter Biden laptop story with you today and how it began and what we know at this point. You spoke here on campus, too, as our Pulliam Fellow. You're teaching some of our students during your 2 weeks here and also gave a lecture recently in front of a number of Hillsdale supporters and Hillsdale faculty members and staff. And you said this is a Russian doll story, and people know those dolls. You open it up and there's another one, and then you open it up and there's another one. In what ways is this Hunter Biden story a Russian doll story as you look into it?
Well, you know, every time you think you've come to the end of the story, there's another layer to be uncovered, which is even more gobsmacking and astonishing and, you know, increasingly frightening. This started off as just a kind of simple story of influence peddling corruption in Washington, D.C., which is pretty much a bipartisan disease and as old as Washington itself. But it's since become an insight into this sort of vast censorship regime that is being implemented by various federal government agencies. But in our case, in the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop and what it revealed about then candidate Joe Biden just before the election of 2020, it's really showing us that the CIA and the FBI were involved in shutting our story down and ensuring that the American voters were not given all the information they needed to make an informed decision in that 2020 presidential election.
You told this story in your lecture, and sometimes as journalists, you hit the pavement and you work sources and you work long hours to try to get the information that you need. Sometimes they drop into your lap. How did this story come to you?
Well, it did. It dropped into my lap. I got a phone call late one night. A text message late one night from a man called Bob Costello, who at that time was the lawyer for Rudy Giuliani, who at that time was the lawyer for then President Donald Trump. And I didn't know Bob Costello, but I did know Rudy Giuliani. And unbeknownst to me, Bob Costello and Rudy Giuliani had possession of a hard drive copy of Hunter Biden's laptop that he'd abandoned some, 18 months earlier at a computer repair shop in Delaware. And the owner of that shop had eventually given it to the FBI and then contacted Rudy Giuliani because he was concerned about the material on the laptop, particularly pertaining to a company in Ukraine that had been paying Hunter Biden, the then vice president's son, $1 million a year. So Bob Costello texts me a few photographs to sort of show proof of life, really, what he was talking about, and said, we have 40,000 emails and 60,000 images and so on. And it's not really the images, it's the documents and the emails that are a story I think you'll be interested in. Are you? And of course I said, well, yeah, I'm interested in pursuing it. And so that sort of became the beginning of the odyssey.
People who are not connected to the news on a daily basis or a weekly basis, perhaps they've heard about the laptop, and first they heard it was not real and it wasn't his, and then it was just misinformation, and then it's just about sex and drugs and just about Hunter, and this is what we're told. What did you find, and what do we need to know about the contents that indicate that there's something deeper, more troubling, and perhaps some element of corruption, or as you said later in your lecture to us, that we might have a compromised president? Where is that evidence? What does it say?
Well, it's been an incredibly sophisticated layer upon layer cover-up of the laptop and denial of its existence, of its provenance, of its, authenticity, etc. The laptop itself is not sufficient. I try to tell people it's a very incomplete record. It has documents and bank statements and evidence of payments and meetings from China, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania, countries around the world where Vice President Joe Biden ran point for the Obama administration. The money was paid to Hunter Biden and his uncle Jim Biden, but there's evidence on the laptop that there's about a dozen times that Joe Biden met with these generous foreign benefactors. He met them in Beijing. He met them in his own home, in vice presidential residence in Washington, D.C. He met them twice at least for dinner in Cafe Milano, which is a restaurant in Georgetown. There's a tiny amount of evidence to show that Joe Biden benefited financially. There's just, it's certainly worth pursuing. There's an email from one of Hunter Biden's business partners laying out some bills that Hunter was expected to pay for his father for the maintenance and upkeep of his Delaware estate, things like new shutters, new air conditioning for a cottage and so on. But it's not really enough, and I think that's where the Republicans in the House, now they have control, are able to access those bank accounts and follow the money.
Talking with Miranda Devine, author of Laptop from Hell, New York Post columnist here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. You said that Joe Biden was the product that Hunter was selling in these negotiations, in these sales. So what exactly was it? Was it access, influence? What do we think, what do we know from the laptop, the evidence that Hunter was actually selling in these negotiations?
Well, I guess he was selling power. When you think about Ukraine, for instance, Joe Biden was, like the viceroy of Ukraine. He was pretty much the most powerful person in Ukraine after the Maidan Revolution. And he would fly into town and be treated like a king and would throw his weight around. And in the most egregious example, this company, this corrupt energy company called Burisma, that was paying Hunter Biden $1 million a year, $83,000 a month, to sit on its board, they were being investigated by the chief prosecutor of Ukraine for corruption. And Joe Biden demanded the firing of the chief prosecutor, a man named Victor Shokin, who I've since interviewed. And, the story that he is corrupt sort of spread around the world and was seeded out to the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on to justify the fact that Joe Biden had threatened to withhold $1 billion of US aid unless this man was basically thrown out. And Victor Shokin had, just before he was removed, had issued a warrant to seize all the property of the owner of Burisma in Kiev. So he was pursuing an active investigation, and clearly you can see in the emails that Burisma is demanding more from Hunter Biden, demanding that he exert his influence and with the powerful people that he knew in Washington, to ensure that Burisma's name was cleared and that these prosecutions, these unjust prosecutions in Ukraine were stopped. And sure enough, as soon as Victor Shokin was fired, those prosecutions did stop, and Burisma got away with a small fine.
From the very beginning, from your first stories and moving forward, there's an attempt by tech companies are involved in an attempt to suppress the story and stop it from spreading and suspending accounts and not allowing it to be, linked. Was there actual collusion happening between tech companies and the government when it comes to the dissemination of this story?
Yes, there was, and we only found that out well after the election, thanks to, in part, the Twitter files, thanks to the investigations by Congress, and also thanks to various very brave whistleblowers. What we now know is that the FBI had gone to Twitter, also Facebook and various other social media companies. Before the election, they were having weekly meetings warning them about Russian disinformation and so on. And we know from Yoel Roth, who was then the chief censor of Twitter, that at some point they were told to look out for a hack and leak operation, likely in October and likely involving Hunter Biden. So in effect, they pre-bunked our story before it saw the light of day. So therefore, as soon as Twitter, Facebook and so on saw our story on the morning of October 14, 2020, they recognized it for exactly what the FBI had been warning them about, and therefore they were able to take swift action to censor it, to bring it down, to lock our account.
What about this letter that was signed by 50-plus members, ex-FBI, ex-CIA, essentially saying this is Russian misinformation. Don't believe it. Joe Biden, uses it, holds it up during the debates with Donald Trump as a get out of jail free card, in essence. What's the motivation of those people who signed it and the FBI? Is it simply the election? Is it simply wanting one candidate to win over another candidate that they would go to these lengths?
Well, yes, and we now know for sure that was the motivation, because various of those 51 former intelligence officials that signed that very dishonest letter that said that the laptop and therefore our reporting was Russian disinformation, those people, which included 5 former CIA directors and acting CIA directors, they've been hauled in before the Judiciary Committee in Congress this year to answer and explain why they wrote such a scurrilous letter, which, as you say, Joe Biden used to get out of jail free in that last debate against Joe Biden, and he used it very effectively, and it really shut down the story. It was the killer blow to our story. And we know from Mike Morell, who was the former acting director of the CIA, hoping to become Biden's CIA director if Biden won. He writes in an email, he organised this letter. He arranged for the signatures of his 50 former colleagues, mostly from the CIA. And he says in an email that this is to help Joe Biden in the debate and to ensure he wins the election. So it's pretty obvious. And also Mike Morell told these Judiciary Committee in this closed-door testimony that he didn't think of the idea himself. He was prompted to write that letter by a phone call from Antony Blinken, now Secretary of State, then a senior advisor for the Biden administration. And Antony Blinken sent him a USA Today article anonymously sourced, I wonder who, saying that, the laptop's Russian disinformation. And so that set him off on this task to please the people that he was hoping would make him finally CIA director.
That's Miranda Devine. We'll talk more with her next about her book, Laptop from Hell, including some more recent developments in the news. More of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour next. Hey, it's Scot Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible in the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Back on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, I'm Scot Bertram, talking with Miranda Devine from Fox News, the New York Post, and her book, Laptop from Hell. Miranda, there are villains in this story, but there also are heroes and whistleblowers. Who are the people who helped bring this story to light and who worked to verify the contents, to work to verify the truth of it?
Well, I think the number one unsung hero and really the man who's suffered as much as anybody for his truth-telling is John Paul MacIsaac. He was the owner of that little, Mac repair shop in Wilmington, Delaware, and he had the misfortune of having Hunter Biden, smelling of alcohol coming from a local cigar bar, walk into his shop late just before closing time with 3 waterlogged laptops. And, people think that John Paul MacIsaac was sort of spying on a client and that's untoward. No, he wasn't. The laptop that he had to upload onto his computer server in his shop was so damaged that it kept on, running out of battery as he was uploading. So he had to keep on rebooting it and looking at the contents to ensure that he wasn't doubling up. And as he did that, there was a lot of homemade porn, drug use, really really disgusting stuff. But also in there were documents, and the name Burisma kept on popping up. And, he's a smart guy. And so after 90 days, that laptop became his property per the work order that Hunter Biden had written. Hunter Biden hadn't paid his $85 bill. He hadn't come and picked up his property, even though he'd been called several times. And so poor John Paul McIsaac is left with this kind of ticking time bomb in his store. And eventually he was so concerned about what was on it, and he felt that it was important to national security, that he called the FBI and finally managed to persuade them to come and pick it up.
I want to slide closer to present day in what we now know. This book is, as we talked about off the air, nearly 2 years old at this point. Missouri v. Biden is a court case moving through, and I think the most recent action was around the 4th of July when a court ruled in Missouri's favor in this particular case. This is about the government collusion, the government leaning on social media to do certain things. What's the importance of Missouri v. Biden, and what could be the eventual result of that case?
Well, it really is a landmark free speech case. It's heading to the Supreme Court now because the Biden administration has appealed the ruling by a judge on 4th of July in favour of the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana who brought this case, thank goodness. And what they've uncovered through discovery is this really malignant sort of method that the federal government violates the First Amendment in spirit and in fact, really, by putting pressure on the social media companies to censor American speech. That included our story, which was censored a few hours after it was published, but also anything that dissented from, the official line, whether it be on the efficacy of vaccines and masks, whether it be on the origins of the Wuhan virus.
Even jokes.
Even jokes, memes about Jill Biden or Joe Biden. This is real Soviet-style crackdown. And also the Ukraine war. Anything that kind of deviated from, the official line, but also really, I guess, the left-wing line on any topic. And it was all part of it was the government producing disinformation and the government kind of criminalizing and suppressing free speech.
Hunter Biden has seen some days in front of a judge due to the weapons charges. There was an immunity deal that fell apart at the very end. What do we make of what happened in that particular case and what it might say about liability elsewhere for the president's son?
Well, we didn't know when we published the story, no one in America knew, that since 2018, the US Attorney in Delaware, David Weiss, had been investigating Hunter Biden. And in fact, in 2019 and 2020, there were at least a dozen tip-offs that came to the DOJ and the FBI about the influence peddling operation of the Bidens. And the then Attorney General, Bill Barr, decided it's difficult to sort out what was sort of election stunts and what was real. And so he funneled everything through to the US Attorney in Pittsburgh, who had to sort of vet the information and see if it's legitimate. And all of the inquiries eventually were, pushed on to Delaware. And it seems that in Delaware, that's where the information went to die because all sorts of really credible allegations from, trusted FBI informants about $5 million bribes to Joe Biden, they were never investigated. The investigators, two more heroes, IRS whistleblowers, Gary Shapley and Joseph Ziegler, said they never saw the laptop. They never saw this informant talking about these bribes in Ukraine. And every time they tried to pursue the normal line of investigation, they were blocked. The Hunter Biden's lawyers were tipped off to search warrants. They were not allowed to ask about who the big guy was. The big guy, we now realize is Joe Biden, who was getting a cut, or supposed to get a cut, according to an email, of a Chinese deal. And so there was obstruction, there was slow walking, and it all culminated in this sweetheart plea deal, astonishing, that went before a judge in Delaware. And because of these IRS whistleblowers having just testified in Congress, the main prosecutor who'd sort of massaged through this sweetheart plea deal was taken off the case, and a pit bull prosecutor was put on who really had to speak honestly about, what the immunity deal was in court, and the judge found it to be rather odd and started asking more questions, at which stage Hunter Biden withdrew his plea deal, his guilty plea, and his lawyers just, there was pandemonium in the court. And so the whole thing was thrown out. And now, because of the pressure, because of the spotlight, Attorney General Merrick Garland made David Weiss a special counsel because supposedly, even though we were told beforehand by Merrick Garland under oath that David Weiss had full authority, ultimate authority to bring charges wherever he wanted. Apparently, he didn't have enough power, as the IRS whistleblower said. So now he has special counsel power, and he knows that the world is watching him, and he knows that there are serious questions about the way he conducted that investigation. So I think Hunter Biden faces some legal jeopardy, and his father really can't protect him now. And I think what they're just trying to do is to quarantine it and ensure that none of the threads are pulled that lead to Joe Biden.
What stories are left to tell from this information, this laptop from hell? What do we still need answers to?
Look, I think there is enough evidence already on the table to show that Joe Biden lied when he told the American people he knew nothing about his son Hunter's overseas business dealings. He was obviously intimately involved in them because he was meeting the business partners and talking to them on the phone and et cetera. But I think what James Comer, the Republican chairman of the House Oversight Committee, is hell-bent on is to follow the money trail to access the bank accounts of Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Jim Biden, the uncle, and just see exactly how the money came from China or Russia and exactly what bank accounts it went into and whether, they can establish that any money went to Joe. I don't think they really need to do that because Joe Biden benefited in so many ways by bills he didn't have to pay,
right,
and, his family being taken care of. And so I think perhaps what we really need to know more about is what I think is the worst quid pro quo is in Ukraine, Viktor Shokin being fired, who was involved in that, how the CIA was complicit, how the FBI, who in the FBI, and how high did it go that was protecting Joe Biden. And there were so many instances where derogatory information about candidate Biden was buried.
Final question for Miranda Devine. She's the author of Laptop from Hell, columnist for the New York Post. As much as media and others try to downplay all of this, we see in polling information that more and more Americans say that they think the president was involved in some sort of criminal or at least corrupting activity. More and more Americans say an investigation is worthwhile and demanded by what we know now. If this is allowed to continue, if it is not suppressed in any way, do you think that this will still be a significant issue when voters head to the ballot box in 2024?
I think so, just in as much as I think Joe Biden, sort of the mythology that he's built around himself in his 50 years in office, starting out in the Senate in Delaware, has really been punctured. He presented himself as honest Joe, modest Joe, lunch pail Joe from Scranton, the poorest man in Congress, a devout Catholic and so on, great family man. I think that enough people have had their eyes opened to the fact that that's not true at all. And I think, it's important because as president, we don't know whether the money that went to his family, the many millions of dollars, has compromised him in the eyes of China or Russia or Ukraine and these other countries. So I think that the stakes are high. So Americans have got their eyes open and they're looking at this man and thinking it's very difficult to resolve the image that he's presented of himself and the reality of the facts that we see of the way he conducted himself and the dysfunction in his family. So I think that's a good thing because, Donald Trump has had a digital colonoscopy. Everybody knows every bad thing in his life and about his character and so on. So I think, there should be equal spotlight on both sides. We're never going to get that.
Yeah.
But at least the laptop has given us this sort of vision into who the real Joe Biden is.
Miranda Devine, author of Laptop from Hell, columnist at the New York Post, and you can find her on X, formerly Twitter, at Miranda Devine. on campus delivering a lecture for us here at Hillsdale, also teaching some of our journalism students. Miranda, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Matt Mehan from Hillsdale, NDC, and Miranda Devine. You can read her at the New York Post, see her on Fox News, and her most recent book, Laptop from Hell. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.